thank you. Thank you also to Gustavo, and a very good afternoon to everyone here. If I'd been stood here just 5 years ago, I would have been talking to you about what we consider to be a very mature water sector in the UK, with innovative regulation, which, as Gustavo said, many people had looked at and adopt some components of. Water companies which were making continued progress for both the environment, for the customers and the services that they provide. But what I am going to talk to you about, in just 5 years, how we have transitioned from that situation to one in which government has decided that a major reset of water governance, delivery, services need to be undertaken in the UK. Now, the reason that's important is, the reason that's important is because whilst some of the issues which have driven that need for a reset may be specific to the UK, in our work in the World Bank, we're very much of the view, as Gustavo said, that many of those issues actually are generic and may be appropriate to take consideration of in jurisdictions across the world. And that's important learning and sharing that we can do. Because in the UK, the situation, wasn't just failure by the sector, but it was the fact that we're all in a transition. So just as a recap, the UK water sector, 62 million people in England and Wales, which is the fully privatised component, 11 water companies, 5 only water companies. So only part of the country is fully privatised. 1989, privatisation. Privatisation was a fundamental decision to take water service delivery off of the public financial books. And government subsequently has not needed to make any real financial contribution. It has been off the books, and that's a tremendous benefit for government. Also, government took the view that the private sector should be able to deliver greater resilience than the public sector. You may or may not have particular views on that, and that's very much the rationale. The view taken at privatisation was to have separate regulators for environment, economics and drinking water quality. And that was a very reasonable decision at that point in time. There's no right answer to many of these things. And you can see here the separation of policy, regulation, compliance and delivery. So what happened post-privatisation? I think many of the hopes of government were very much realised. We saw a significant increase in investment, very significant, increase in efficiency and improvements in services to customers and the environment. And if you look at current key performance and KPIs for the UK water sector, they're actually pretty good by an international benchmark. Drinking water quality, very high against international performance, good levels of service, low interruptions to customers, non-revenue water down at record levels with major innovations driving it even further. Water bills very much at a European average, and when you consider that water is off the financial took to be people that didn't understand what we were doing very well. They weren't very well informed. And this was an important mistake that we made, not to listen to society, not to understand changes that were taking place in society. And the differences between reality and perception are incredibly important. And we lived in a world, we thought, where we were focusing on reality, not what people thought. Some of the real concerns that people had for the water sector was partly because it was privatised, was a focus on profiteering by companies' investors and a narrative in the media that economic regulation wasn't being sufficiently robust in making sure that customers' money was being spent wisely and wasn't going into inappropriate profits for both UK and international shareholders. Also, what has happened recently is a growing increase in expectations by society for environmental standards. And whilst environmental standards have improved considerably, there are still failures in the system, particularly with stormwater overflows with combined systems, which are very difficult to deal with. So whilst environmental improvements generally are very good, there were these incidents which were very, very well publicised in the paper. Effectively, the water sector lost control of the narrative with society. We failed to communicate what we were doing well, and being always not necessarily transparent about what we weren't doing well. And that came back onto the sector. And what we discovered is, with the changing nature of news media and social media, that a small number of very well motivated people can have a very significant impact in the perception of our sector. So the independent review, there were 3 reviews. One was by the National Audit Office, one was specifically on regulation, and one was the overarching Cunliffe review, which Gustav spoke about just now. Sort of 7 key recommendation areas: strategic direction of the sector, stronger leadership, and I'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. Planning, a shift to a systems-based approach to planning, not planning in silos, recognising the world is much more complex and it needs to go across not just all the water system, but also links to energy, agriculture, food security, etc. Very much legislative framework. It had evolved over the years, but that evolution hadn't always been coordinated, and it needs to be brought back together into coherent legislation that doesn't always drive conflicting priorities in regulators and companies. Regulatory reform, which Gustavo talked about just now, consolidating the regulators, looking at company structures and ownership and making sure that their incentives are aligned with society's ambitions, and infrastructure and asset health, a major area for improvement. Worth just touching on the case for change that the Cunliffe Review came up with, because I think these are quite important, and many of these may resonate with some of you and your jurisdictions. It'll be interesting to have that discussion. The nature and pace of change for water and sanitary services has become more complex and much more dynamic and much more integrated. Legislating and regulating smartly is set to become increasingly challenging for water services, and I'm hoping to talk about smart regulation in our panel session a little bit later. Key sector. We should have spotted the need for change earlier than we did, and had we done so, and maybe if other jurisdictions are able to do so, it can actually benefit everyone, but particularly the trust and confidence in this sector. So as my final slide, a few characteristics in regulation. The more mature a sector gets, the more difficult it is to reconcile efficiency and risk, and we need to get better at that. The environment underpins everything, and horizon scanning has never been more important for this sector. We need to have a risk register that looks to the future, and we need to learn and understand when and how to adapt. Thank you. I hope that's been useful. Thank you for your time this morning.